Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by author Ian C. Esslemont. Cameron, how are you doing, my friend?
Hello, thanks for having me on, AP.
Well, the reason we are having this discussion is you're a bit of a fan of Robert E. Howard,
Very much so.
and there's a recent discussion I had with Stephen Erikson, which I still haven't had uh, put up on the channel yet. I must get around to that. But we were talking about how people quite frequently locate Tolkien at the center of the genre, and they forget about all of these other strands. One of which, obviously, is the pulps and adventure and action stories. And Robert E. Howard is a key component of all of that. So that was a discussion I was having with Stephen Erikson, and then you had mentioned that you had a particular view of Howard and his work and a way to read his work. So I thought we could have a discussion about that today.
hmm Um, yeah, this all comes out of Howard being lumped together with Tolkien, and as by earlier critics saying that, well, they're fantasy writers, and so they're all sort of put together. And I think, well, no, these are two very different animals representing two very different threads. And I'm not, of course, I'm not a Howard scholar. I'm not up on the most recent literature surrounding his critical works looking at him. Um, but I will, come at it as an author and someone who grew up reading it and has been a long time aficionado. And I wanted to look at Howard as someone who actually reacted against Tolkien and that thread of high fantasy. In the same way, so to speak, that Wordsworth was reacting against much more ornate poetry that drew on classical allusions and was heavy with ornate syntax and archaic uh, wording. And he wanted a more direct language, Wordsworth, for example. So he was reacting against something else. And then I think in the same way, you could look at Howard and the authors of the pulps as using language in a different way that reacts is a reaction against an older tradition. And when I say Tolkien, I'm also talking about William Morris and
Mhm.
Lord Dunsey. Like this goes back
Yeah,
quite
yeah.
far.
It's not hard reacting against Tolkien. It's hard reacting against
Yeah,
the strand and the sort of the stream that Tolkien was part of. That's what you meant.
yeah, sort of the one that most people know these days. Yeah,
Yeah.
and sorry.
Well, I was going to say, like, this, I think, is a really interesting and an important distinction because we look at the tradition that Tolkien is part of, and yeah, it's tied up in the language, but it's also tied up in that particular approach to um, epic storytelling, and it is Morris and going back to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and that whole tradition of the grand ornate epics, and then with the pulps regardless of the specific genre or subgenre within the pulps. Like we could talk about the westerns and the ghost stories and the gothic pulps and action adventure, and obviously we're going to end up with
Crime stories. And
noir and Conan and that whole oeuvre. But with the pulps, it was almost going back to a Dickensian approach of populist fiction written for a almost disposable reading and playfulness and mainstream audience, not literary appreciation. Although you and I both bristle at this distinction into high literature and pulpish low common genre, but narrative crafted for an audience to be published in magazines, to be published serially. That a lot of those pulpish stories were about plot centric or very plot focused, no matter how well written, but there was a lot focused on movement and action within the plot of driving a thrilling narrative forward rather than the more sedate, stately, slow evolution of things that you find in the grander or larger scale novels. Would that
Mhm.
be kind of on point?
Well, yes, I think that's part of it. And you just look at the titles of some of these magazines, of course, right? Weird Tales, and I don't know if Thrilling Tales was another title, but it might have been. And Black Mask,
Astounding,
yeah, astounding,
astounding, amazing.
astonishing, et cetera, et cetera. They're certainly they are in a very competitive market, and they're trying to get the attention of someone who only has a certain amount of time. Uh, and they're also trying to make a living at it. So they're banging this stuff out really, really fast. Some authors, this is their sole income. So they didn't have the luxury of being like an Oxford Don or um, a actual lord. So they had no other support.
I suppose in a lot of respects, it's quite almost closer to the modern paradigm than that what Tolkien was doing, because a lot of modern writers, modern authors, yeah, writing is one, but they have day jobs, they have other jobs that are their main income, and writing is the thing that's going on. We live in a world that there are multiple uh, media formats and narratives clamoring for our attention. And so hooking the reader early, getting them enthralled early, keeping their attention as much as possible, because there isn't an assumption that people are just going to be sedate and take their time and have all of the time and leisure time in the world to slowly move through something that um, the things
Mhm.
that the pulps were doing. That's what we're seeing very much almost a not necessarily a resurgence. It's always been there, but that aspect of commercial fiction becoming stronger and stronger and stronger, whereas fiction, uh, no matter what genre or literary fiction, is becoming um, rarer in certain circumstances because it is a luxury of time uh,
Yeah.
for the reader.
Um, and I think that Howard also bristled against this tradition in the genre of the sort of king in exile, or the fated chosen one. And he very much so saw, wanted to write about the self-made person that who sort of accomplishes things on their own. And it's that sort of man versus nature, traditional thematic study that can apply here. So we have a language break with, say, in literary criticism terms, like Hemingway, bringing a sort of a journalistic newspaper style of writing, short sentences, punchy, and simpler language to his medium, together with thematics that are much more about the self-made man or woman, to modern parlance, uh, out there confronting a hostile world and trying to make their own fate.
And even with just that synopsis that you've given, you can see how that ties into a lot of the modern movement of grimdark. That that is, although grimdark maybe expresses it slightly differently, that's at the heart of a lot of these stories that focus on an uncaring, hostile world and forging your own way across it, making your way through the world. Um, I think politically, some of those, well, not all, but like some of the stories have that almost libertarian edge to them. And reaction, I suppose, would Hard really have been reacting against socialism in that way? But manifest
May
destiny, the carving out of your own destiny.
may have, but that idea of carving out of your own destinies, but I think is very, very central, certainly to Howard. But at the same time, in the pulps, there were other authors who were his compatriots, writing and publishing at the same time. For example, the and this is the other genres we talked about. So you have in crime fiction and detective stories, you have Dashiell Hammett publishing at in the same time in the 30s, and Raymond Chandler as well publishing. And these are what we now call the noir heroes, Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. They are men who are walking the mean streets and sort of making their own way as independent individuals through a corrupt world. So I would say that Howard, I'm sure he was looking at what these other authors were doing. These are his competition. I'm sure he was looking at Black Mask magazines and reading these other authors and seeing what they're up to. And, oh, that works. I like that. Or, and just getting a feel for the industry. And so I'm sure there's no evidence of it, but I think he probably looked at some of these stories. And then in the Conan stories, I see a lot of these noir elements in the pieces and in the character himself.
Well, we've talked before about how the narrative influences on an author, like they come from everywhere. Modern authors are influenced by not only the books that they've read, but films that they've seen, television shows that they've seen, computer games that they have played, games, ludic influences. All of these things influence storytelling because you don't just go, I'm going to write a book, therefore it is only ever the other books that I have read are my inspirations. It is
yes.
a giant cauldron of story.
You're responding to the times.
Yeah.
And as long as you're not a hermit in a cave, you are aware of current trends, and you are trying to express your times. Yeah.
Although, authors who live in caves, very rare. But those garrets that you live in, apparently all authors live in a garret.
Caves. Yeah, so except they're up at the top of the house or apartment.
What I find fascinating is obviously with a lot of the noir and with Howard's Conan, there's a very particular type of masculine identity that is being proposed. Like this hyper masculinity might be too far.
Well,
I think.
Yeah, I'm okay. There's an essay that was in a collection a long time ago that talked about Howard as a hard-boiled fantasist. And so think about the hard-boiled detective.
Yeah.
He's a tough guy, two-fisted. He can fight gangsters. He can gets into gunfights. So, and that's a very masculine figure, right? Or the cinematic model that really sort of defined it, the Bogart representation of that mode of masculinity. Mm-hmm. I would put Conan into that slot, into that sort of version of a tough guy masculine mode.
Yeah, because I don't think it's as simplistic as this is a toxic masculinity being represented. I think it's much more about a form of masculinity, emphasizing physical strength, canniness, and an inner morality or an inner strength, the will to forge your own way. Because Conan did have morals. They were not necessarily imposed on him. It was what he believed to be right.
It was a personal code of honor. In the same way, these noir detectives have a personal code of honor. They might do dirty things, but they're trying to say, for example, right wrongs or champion their clients' interests. They're following their own version that they see of honor, and the same thing for Conan.
But I do think that even across the noir works, as well as in certain elements in Hard, that there are elements of misogyny and of that sort of very toxic masculine perspective. But again, just because it's included in the text is not necessarily an endorsement of that behavior. But it was certainly, even if it doesn't go as far as misogyny in all cases, there was an element of chauvinism to it. And it was that portrayal of the strength of the male, quite often at the detriment of the female. Um, so for a modern reader, that can be a real struggle, even with.
And being off-putting. But if you look carefully at a lot of the classic Howard Conan pieces, there are actually very strong female characters. Belit, for example, this queen of pirate queen, and there are other queens who are running their countries and doing quite a damn good job of it. So it's not just one
Mhm.
version of things. And yes, there's the damsel in distress, and that pops up, now and then. And there's the whole, the eroticism, the sexuality, especially the projected by the covers, which are a great marketing gimmick. I mean, nothing sells like sex, as everyone knows, and so it's a very deliberate choice to put that sort of image on the cover. You're just trying to sell magazines.
Uh, because they maybe weren't quite lewd, but they were certainly lurid. Um,
Lurid, yes.
and and again, it was that trying to sell, I suppose, in some ways, a power fantasy. Um, and we see this time and time again. It's a very valid form of narrative, which is trying to sell a power fantasy or an adolescent fantasy. But I think dismissing and pigeonholing hard, or any of the pulps that were playing with this, dismissing
Or
them
most
solely as
superhero comics.
yeah, and you know, I've I'm fascinated by superhero comics because and superhero narratives because what we see quite often in film versions lacks the complexity that a lot of the stuff that happens in the actual comic books themselves represents, and how it's not just about punching the bad guy in the face. That quite often the media adaptations tend to be more simplified um, forms of the narrative than what we get in the actual comics themselves, and it creates a strange perception. I think we have that with Conan as well.
Yeah, isn't that always the case, right?
That the film versions with Arnold Schwarzenegger and there was a cartoon I think made, and there were all of these and comic adaptations that focused on like the big bulging, powerful masculine figure, doing male things, and it lacked some of the nuance, quite simply, that we have in Hard's actual works.
Oh yeah. Well, and yes, I mean, he does emphasize he's a big guy. He's very strong. He can win whatever sort of physical confrontation he might fall into. And that's all about being able to suborn that hostile world that he's in. And if he had been a average guy and died in the first story, we wouldn't have much of a compendium of work to look at, would we?
But like even when you mention the compendium of work, like so many of the Conan stories were not initially Conan stories, and there may have been some editorial interference to change a number of other stories and Conanize them.
Yeah, this is a sad tale, and I don't know if we have the time to go into this in any great detail, but a couple of author and self-aggrandizing authors stepped in and decided that they would correct or complete his works and edit them and I guess improve them, and did a great disservice to his work. And now there are collections where all of that is sort of sorted out, and you can actually see the actual real Howard pieces versus these others that were put out in his name, that he did not actually intend to be Conan stories. But we're talking about Conan, but we could talk about Cull or Bran MacMorn or his other uh, characters in other stories as well, and a lot of this applies, of course, to them.
And certainly one of the lasting influences that Hard actually had was when we look at say like D&D, the idea of the barbarian warrior, the strong barbarian that we see so often in a lot of these fantasy worlds. Whether or not Hard is the direct reference for that particular author who's created it, but certainly it's very difficult to look at Hard in the early 20th century and look at these barbarian figures that we get in D&D, and then it becomes promulgated and popularized after that. You go, that seems to be a very direct link because it's not coming from Tolkien. It's not coming from the Tolkien vein or thread of or river of story. It's coming from something entirely different. Um, and I think that's one of the lasting impacts that Hard had was that focus on the action and adventure, which is something that D&D very heavily focused on, that those stories focused on, that those stories popularized. And because of that, because of leaning into that genre element, those pulp elements, it is something that is integral to fantasy storytelling today, to the genre today, that is radically different to Tolkien. And you only need to look at the difference between Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Peter Jackson's film version of the Lord of the Rings to see that Peter Jackson takes that more pulpish action adventure stance in adapting Tolkien's work and has actually moved it in the direction of a hard story rather than maintaining what Tolkien was trying to
do. Well, in the genre today, both threads are, of course, still surviving and going on, and you have fantasy novels based in either approach. And it's interesting, though, that there's a shorthand, if you will, that other mediums like to take, and it's for contemporary audiences anyway. It certainly favors a more journalistic, sort of newspaper prose approach in writing or in filmic narrative, drama and confrontation. So we're dealing with that.
Yeah, and I think it's not even that you choose which tradition that is going to be your main inspiration. I think at this stage now in the genre, people writing today, that there are so many different threads that are now so interwoven that trying to find Urtext, trying to find like these distinct traditions, we can go back, to look at Hard, but if you're looking at Hard, you're also looking at the time period of the planetary romance, the Lost Land tale, the action adventure pulps, all of those things that, fantasy wasn't established the way that it is now. Mm-hmm. So, Hard wasn't necessarily writing, I'm going to, create this type of fantasy. How he perceived what he was doing would have been radically different to how we, looking back on it, perceive.
Oh, yeah. If you look at some of his letters and his readings, he was very taken by the historical narrative, like Talbot Mundy, for example. And he favored that. And I think that is one of the things that he might say he was trying to do, was write histories of the sort that he wished had been. It's like, this is what I wish history had been like. This is my alternate history of the world that he's writing.
Or alternate prehistory, because, it's...
Yes. Yeah, it's not history in the sense that so there's a continuous narrative from us to then, but way back in the mists of time.
And obviously, like I had quite a heated argument with yourself and Mr. Erikson about an aspect of this, but looking at Tolkien, like one of the ways of looking at Tolkien's Middle Earth is that it is directly connected to our world, that the third age of Middle Earth was going to end and eventually evolve into our world. And when we read Tolkien's work, you never get that sense. You don't feel that it is deeply connected to this world. But with Hard, hard, even though a lot of looking at the map for the Hyborian, you can kind of disentangle it and stretch it out and sort of go, oh, well, I can see where these bits came from in
Wasn't
this.
a geographer, yeah.
Um, but it seems that with Hard's work, that he intended it as deeply connected and rooted to this world, that there would be an evolution over time, and this at some point, like a lot of this stuff got forgotten, and there was a reset of some kind, and we've emerged out of it having forgotten this prehistory. But his world is in fact, more deeply connected to ours than Middle Earth, despite, Tolkien saying, oh, you don't see hobbits anymore because they hide from us, kind of thing that you got at the start of The Lord of the Rings. Um, and so it's very soon. I see both of these as elements that uh, over time have led to the modern conception of the secondary world, which is part of the argument that I had with
Yeah, yeah.
you and your esteemed colleague. But
Where did that distinction, where did that idea come from? And that's that sort of thing. Yeah. And I think, yes, he may have certainly, we can't discuss authorial intention to get to the truth, but we can say that he probably fully intended that there was a direct connection, and he actually worked it out with more contemporary stories between this Hyborian age and then the eventual historical age, and it lies underneath. It's been subsumed and is been lost to time, and I think this all feeds in so very well to the other approaches that you mentioned, like the lost world narrative, where someone from our time trips over a remnant of this prior age, and be it back in the time, Haggard, for example, writing of that, or Poe writing of it in his works. That's one of the contributors, and can be looked at for discussions of secondary worlds, I think.
yeah, because again, like the concept of the secondary world, the concept of all of these sorts of things didn't just immediately appear. Go, oh, here is this thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because it's all different steps, side steps, partial movements forward, two steps forwards, one step back, drawing on one thing and another. The whole idea of Asgard as a separate realm, you can see why. Oh well, that's attractive. I can set things in the mythical realm of Asgard, and it doesn't have to then correspond to things on Earth. The Hollow Earth stories where they go down into a cave and there's a mystical world down there. It means that you can do things, you can bring things through that, people, it might strain their credulity to believe that it is part of the setting, because you can say, oh, but it survived down here in this mysterious place. The Skull Island and, Kong, the more that we map the world, the more difficult it is to establish, oh, well, there was this island that we just never found before that had these things on it. So
Yeah.
you can see the attraction in creating fantasy or secondary landscapes that are in some way disconnected from the contemporary readership. And we can do that with distance. We can do it with different planets. We can do it through portals. And I think Hard, in part, does it through time, setting it in the far past and having that quite strong break between where the contemporary reader is and the past. That these are all different ways of creating a fantasy world that is in some way separate. It's
Yeah.
not the only way, and
That's a good point about, I thought it was a good point about using time as that method of distancing. And, I think that's a good point. And so, yeah, these worlds, call them secondary or not, give authors room to explore the things that they want to explore. And they sort of have a freer hand, I would say, so to do things and to have representations. Like Howard's, part of his success was he brought in strong elements of horror from these other contemporary pulp authors, and he was a big admirer of Lovecraft, of course. And so in his pieces, he has macabre, supernatural, and horror elements that are even touch into a Cthulhian mythology, and these and even older ages, Atlantean ages, and back far prior to before the Hyborian age. He's playing with all of these issues of elder civilizations being the roots of various mythologies.
And of course, he was writing at a time when it was the heyday of tomb raiding. Sorry, archaeology of all of these ancient ruins being discovered, and it was oh no, we always thought this was a myth, and then we found the city that this myth was based on. Oh look, and then we nicked a whole load of stuff out of it and put it in a museum. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Um,
Yeah,
this was was it antiquarians, was that what they were called rather
prior
than
antiquarians. Yeah, you had Carter in Egypt, and then you had also Sumerian ruins being unearthed, and you have discoveries in India, and all of these elder civilizations coming out of the earth, and certainly, I think that's part of the mix.
and so we can see that with that happening in the real world of oh look, we find this mythical place, we find this ancient place, we find this civilization that we didn't know was there before, that adds an element of mystique. And obviously we've just glossed over the fact that a lot of this was colonial, let's go and just nick stuff from other countries.
Oh yeah, you've mentioned that, and it's certainly true.
um but it adds an element to the Conan stories that maybe today the modern reader doesn't quite understand, that interest in oh they've just found all of this and it being front page news, or at least important news in the local broadsheets of they've found this at the pyramids, they've uncovered this, oh look, we find that thing. That there was a real excitement about it and a mystery, an actual fantasy element in the real world
I
that I
was going
think
to say,
Hard was tying
yeah,
into.
I was going to say that it actually lends very similar to it. People can react to that and say, "Oh yes, well that's entirely possible to trip over some previously unknown civilization." Nowadays, I suppose it might be less, uh, might not be able to make that statement so easily. But,
And it is, I think, a lot of modern narratives strain with trying to do that in the modern world. I mean, I don't know if you remember, there was a Steven Spielberg movie, Arachnophobia, and the premise of that was they had found this sealed off basically valley that it was completely sealed off from everywhere around it, and it was a sort of almost like a jungle crater or something. And that's where these species that had never interacted with any other species were found. Um, and it's becoming more and more difficult to sell locations like that from the real world, which is, I think, why the idea of a completely separate secondary world has become so popular in fantasy, because you then just go, oh, no, divorce it, or you put in a portal and you can move from the primary reality to the secondary reality. But it's it's interesting how the modern day not only reshapes our understanding of what's in the text, but how it was even received, and how our different cultural concerns, our different knowledge of the world, and even how the genre has evolved over time, completely alters how we approach it. Because we look at the Conan stories very much in the vein of fantasy. Like they are billed as fantasy stories. They're part of the fantasy genre. But because it didn't exist as the fantasy genre back then, at least not anywhere close to how we conceive of it now,
no.
that they weren't thought of or approached the same way.
And speaking of that, a modern interpretation or looking at the stories, to sort of further set the sword and sorcery, if you will, aside, and Conan, I would also like to bring up another proposal that was made by an essay some time ago, where it was put forward that Conan is an existentialist. And I would like to sort of support that and say that we can look at him as one of the first existentialist heroes of the fantasy genre. Maybe I don't know. I haven't done a full survey, uh, but I think we could read him that way. Oh, quiet! I've silenced AP.
Well, I hadn't heard that point before. I was actually thinking about it, instead of just shooting off my mouth, which,
Oh, this could
okay,
be
fair enough.
another.
I do that
This
a
could
lot.
be another post. This could be a different post.
Um, but I mean, that's certainly interesting. I'm trying to think of other heroes or anti-heroes prior to Conan that would fulfill that role.
Yeah,
Well, in fantasy, and that's where I'm tripping up, because you can look at.
think you can think about it. I thought, and I couldn't come up with a name right away. But so let me say, he, as he's portrayed in the stories, rejects his God. He says you can't rely on gods or God, and singular or plural, them. And he very much believes he can make his own fate. He considers himself self-made, and that you sort of have to create yourself. I think then there's a lot of existential philosophy fits in with his views on life at least as put forward in those stories.
Well, I think actually this would be a good thing to ask the viewers about. If they would like to leave comments commenting on this very specific aspect, that'd be great, because it's not something I've done a huge amount of research into.
Yeah.
Like a lot of
And
my
I'm not claiming that this is my idea. This is there's an essay in the 70s, I think, by a fellow Charles Hoffman, where he proposes Conan is an existentialist, and goes through and compares some of his statements to Sartrean quotes, and there's a nice alignment. And so we'll have to go dig that up.
yeah. A lot of my knowledge of the pulps was much more rooted in the science fiction pulps because of what I studied. So I weirdly know a bit more about the science fiction pulps than I do about the sort of the more fantasy pulps. But again, I think seeing them as completely disparate, saying, like, oh, those are the fantasy pulps, those are the science fiction pulps, is missing the point that a lot of the stuff was um, not necessarily viewed that way, that it had a common readership and common authorship quite a lot of the time.
I was
And
going
it
to
was
say that. Yeah, some of them wrote science fiction stuff, and Howard wrote tons of we would call now boxing or pugilistic stories that were in pulps magazines that were featured all about fighting and ring fighting and boxing. He wrote westerns, cowboy stories, stories based in the oil rigs as well, and these all went into other pulps. But if you're talking Conan, you're talking Weird Tales.
So there was a really rich culture of the pulps, but like anything, there were some shockingly bad stories. Like there were some like truly atrocious, poorly written. Oh, they would make your eyes bleed to read now.
Well, this stuff was just pushed out as fast as possible. There was no revising, no going back over the sentence. It's just as soon as you were done, you threw it in the mail.
But Cam, thank you very much for having this discussion with me. I really do. Like, this is a lot of fun, particularly when we're talking about something that I am not as confident in my knowledge of, because I get a chance to learn. I get a chance to find out more. And that is always a welcome opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, AP.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.